Tonight I'm going to give you, I'm going to offer a Dharma talk, a very brief Dharma talk about the basics. And I'll begin it with paying homage to the Buddha once and taking refuge once. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa Buddhang saranang gacchami Dhammang saranang gacchami Sanghang saranang gacchami. So as I said, I'd like to offer you the basics tonight, and somewhere in the suttas there is a comment that there's 4 ways to wake up, 4 ways to get enlightened. One way is to meditate, which is what we've just been doing. Another way is to recite the Dharma. And I know that usually we have someone here having a reading, and that's what I would call reciting the Dharma. Another way is to listen to the Dhamma. So, by listening to these recitations, the readings, and also to Dharma talks is a way of waking up. And yet another way of waking up is by teaching the Dhamma. So tonight I hope to fulfill at least 2 of those functions. Me giving a talk and you perhaps listening to a Dharma talk. And what I'd like to talk about are the 4 Noble Truths, because there's lots of different traditions in Buddhism. There's lots of different ways we understand the teachings of the Buddha. Yet fundamental to them all are these basics of the 4 truths, the 4 Noble Truths. The 4 Noble Truths were expounded on the Buddha's first discourse, the discourse called setting in motion the turning of the wheel of Dhamma, which he gave to the 5 ascetics some weeks after, or sometime after he was awakened, like I think 6 weeks or so. He gave a discourse and he expounded the 4 truths. The 4 truths are, of course, the 4 Noble Truths are, the first truth is the reality of dukkha. Dukkha meaning often translated as suffering, but probably best understood as unsatisfactoriness. The second Noble Truth is the origins of dukkha. The third Noble Truth is freedom from dukkha, nibbana or nirvana if in Sanskrit. And the fourth Noble Truth is the path leading to awakening, the Noble Eightfold Path. So I'm going to go into a little bit of detail in this short Dharma talk about these 4 realities. So dukkha. The dukkha is, it's on a spectrum. And many of you among us have been chanting these chants about dukkha for years, like me. Like for 48 years I've been chanting about dukkha. And many of you have been doing it for that long as well. Dukkha, as we chant it, is birth, aging, sickness and death is dukkha. Pain, including emotional pain. Pain, grief, lamentation and despair is dukkha. Getting what you don't want, not getting what you want, and being parted from what is dear to you is dukkha. In fact, clinging to 5 aggregates, 5 groups of experience, form, feeling, perceptions, mental formations and consciousness, as a lasting, enduring, independent self is intrinsically dukkha. It's a broad spectrum from the gross of dukkha to the very, very subtle. And I often make bit of a joke about this. At the gross end of the spectrum, it's the terrible stuff like torture and terminal illnesses and so on. And at the subtle end of the spectrum, we have the subtle dissatisfaction of not getting our soy chai latte exactly how we want it. So it's a broad spectrum. The second noble truth, the truth of the origins of suffering, when the Buddha expounded this discourse, he said craving is a cause of suffering. And of course, craving is a very important link in dependent arising, which outlines a number of factors working together interdependently, co-arising. And craving is a key factor, but it's not the only one. And this dependent arising, this cycle of suffering that we get caught up in, is driven by greed, ignorance, and hatred. Greed refers to clinging, grasping and craving after pleasant experience. Ignorance refers to here not seeing things as they actually are, not perceiving, not understanding, not apprehending, just not seeing the way things actually are, like being clouded by veils of delusion. And hatred refers to craving to push away. Hatred refers to condemnation, avoidance, aversion, and this general not wanting to experience things. So these are the causes of. This is the second noble truth, the causes of suffering. The third noble truth is the noble truth of freedom, the noble truth of nibbana. And it's explained in many different ways as the supreme happiness or supreme peace, supreme happiness, and also freedom. And it's freedom from being bound in these cycles that we get caught up in, bound in these cycles of suffering that we all experience and perpetuate our suffering. It arises when we can short-circuit that factor of craving as one example, then we don't have dukkha. When there's no cause for our suffering, when there's no craving as an example, then there is no suffering, and that is liberation, that is nibbana. And the fourth truth is the truth of the Noble Eightfold Way, the Noble Eightfold Path, which is has 8 factors, 3 groupings. The groupings are Sila, Samadhi, Panya. Sila refers to ethics. Samadhi refers to meditation or cultivation or bhavana. And wisdom, and Panya refers to wisdom. So these 3 groupings, they usually begin with wisdom actually. So it's right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort or right energy, right mindfulness and right concentration. The term right is a translation of the Pali term samma. And samma has many different ways of describing it, but I think probably the best way of understanding it is as a right direction. And I live in Lismore. If I was to go to home in Lismore, I would be travelling north. That's the right direction. If I wanted to go to Lismore but I travel south, I'd be going in the wrong direction. So that's the way this is understood. The term right means it's the right way of practicing this particular factor in the direction of awakening. So in the Buddha, in the sutta, sorry, the Buddha almost described these Four Noble Truths as a sequence. In fact, he did. He sort of described them as a sequence. And as Stephen Le Batchelor talks about these, the way he described the Four Noble Truths, he described them almost like tasks, which is very, very interesting. And the task of dukkha, the first Noble Truth, and it's in this sequence, by the way, the first task for us is to approach dukkha and understand it. That's the task of that first truth. And when we understand it, when we see deeply into dukkha, when we turn towards dukkha to apprehend it and understand it, what arises is a realization about the second truth, which is the origins of suffering. And the task of the origins of suffering, which is greed, ignorance, and hatred, is to release these origins, to release these causes. And when we release these causes, it moves on to the third truth, the third Noble Truth, which is freedom. When there's no cause for suffering, as I mentioned earlier, there is no suffering. When there's no cause for dukkha, there's no dukkha. So in the release of our causes, we have the arising of freedom. And the task of this truth, the task of the third truth, is to realize it, is to recognize it, to actually say, wow, this is it. And that leads on to the fourth truth, ironically. And one would think two cause-effect relationships, suffering and its causes, suffering, dukkha, and its causes are the second Noble Truth. One would think it should be, the sequence should go the third Noble Truth here. The third Noble Truth should be the path. But in the discourse, he outlines it like this. So the task of the fourth truth, the path, is to live it, is to practice it, is to be it, to practice on the path of awakening. Now these truths have often been symbolised by a lotus growing out of the sludge and slime and compost at the bottom of a pond. A beautiful lotus arises from the sludge and slime at the bottom of the pond. So, it's heartening because when we can see that, when the sludge and slime at the bottom of the pond refers to our dukkha, of course, and it's from our dukkha that we can have freedom. If we think about that sequence again, we need to have dukkha in order to awaken from dukkha. It's kind of paradoxical, but it's the way it is. And what we hear from Thich Nhat Hanh, and I know there's a calligraph up in the main house, it says, no mud, no lotus. In other words, no dukkha, no enlightenment. Very interesting. So I think this basic understanding of the Four Noble Truths can be applied to our everyday activities, everyday life. The term noble refers to awakening experiences, in particular, as we described, nibbana. So, but there's another way of understanding these truths, and that is as ennobling truths. And ennobling truths refer to being on the way to have the way to nibbana, but not actually experiencing or realizing that truth. So, and I say the ennobling path and the ennobling way can be related back to our everyday activities, everyday life. So it's heartening, no matter whether we're on a retreat or in daily life, if we can actually turn our attention to understanding the dukkha we're experiencing, we can liberate ourselves from that, albeit relatively. The other day I was having some dukkha, and I was kind of struggling. It was about kind of differences in teachers' doctrinal approaches to the Dharma, and I was struggling with it. And I was saying, no, this person's right and that person's wrong, and so on and so forth. And there was quite a bit of churning up. And then I just realised, hold on a minute, Malcolm. Here's some dukkha. Where there's dukkha, there's a way to be free from dukkha. What's the cause of this dukkha? It was my clinging to a particular view. So all I needed to do was release the view, and then I had freedom, relative freedom. So, and in daily life, often it's hard to turn towards our dukkha in that moment. But if we can acknowledge it and recognise it, there's a possibility of freedom there and then. So thank you very much for your listening to the Dhamma. Maybe one of us or all of us have been awakened here with this possibility of hearing the Dhamma, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Thank you.